The city was already a corpse before the fighting for it truly began. By autumn 1942, Stalingrad was less a place than a wound stretched 25 miles along the Volga. And before the guns fell silent, more than 1 million men on both sides would be dead, missing or broken past repair. Hold on to one number: 300,000. That is how many men marched into this city under the field gray banners of Germany's 6th Army, the most decorated formation in Hitler's arsenal, a force that had never once lost a battle fought on its own terms. 91,000 walked out alive, hands raised, feet wrapped in newspaper against 40 degrees of frost. Fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. This is how an empire's finest army was fed, division by division, into a city it never needed to take. And the story of the one man at its center who broke the single rule. Hitler expected every field marshal to obey without question. His name was Friedrich Paulus, and history has almost nothing warm to say about him. Not a war criminal, not the kind of hero propaganda required. He was something rarer and more damning: a meticulous, obedient staff officer, built for planning rooms and situation maps, suddenly handed an army and a city that refused to behave like anything he had studied at war college. Paulus followed orders. That single trait was the whole of his character, and it became the mechanism that ground 300,000 men into the mud of the Volga. Forget Stalingrad for a moment to understand how it began. Hitler never wanted the city itself. He wanted the oil fields of the Caucasus, 700 miles south, the fuel to keep his tanks moving. Stalingrad was meant only as a flank shield, a name on a map to be secured and forgotten. But the name on the map was Stalin's, and that changed everything. A strategic sideshow curdled into a personal duel between two dictators, each certain that losing this city would prove the other man stronger. Neither would pay the cost of that vanity. Their soldiers would. On the 23rd of August, the Luftwaffe answered the opening question of the battle in a single afternoon. Over 1,000 sorties dropped incendiaries and high explosives onto a city still full of ordinary life that morning, and by dusk Stalingrad was a firestorm visible for 100 miles. Oil tanks along the riverbank ruptured and turned the Volga into a sheet of drifting flame. Close to 40,000 civilians died that day, more than in the entire London Blitz. The Germans believed they'd broken the city before the battle had even started. They were wrong in a way that would cost them everything. Rubble is built for the kind of fighting German doctrine had no answer for. No open ground for tanks, no sight lines for artillery. Only shattered rooms and cellars where a rifle and a knife mattered more than a panzer division. General Vasily Chukov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army with its back against the river, understood what the ruins offered before his enemy did. He ordered his men to fight as close to the German lines as physically possible, a tactic his soldiers grimly called hugging the enemy, since it meant the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb Soviet positions without hitting their own men. Every building became its own battle, fought room by room for days at a time. Mamayev Kurgan, a hill overlooking the city, changed hands more than a dozen times, its soil turning so thick with shrapnel that nothing grew there for years. A single apartment block, later known as Pavlov's house, was held by one Soviet platoon for 58 days. Longer, one bitter joke among German officers noted, than it had taken the Wehrmacht to conquer all of France. A fresh Soviet soldier's life expectancy crossing the Volga into that grinder was measured, by some accounts, in a single day. If stories like this are why you keep coming back, subscribe now. Because what happened to the men trapped in this city that winter is darker still? Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. Now back to the ruins. Through September and October, Paulus fed his divisions into that grinder one at a time, exactly as Berlin demanded, exactly as his training had taught him to obey. 90% of the city fell under German control by November, an achievement that looked, on a bunker map, like victory. It wasn't. The 10th, still held by Chukov's dying army, sat along the riverbank in shrinking pockets, and taking it would cost more men than the first night he had. Obsessed with the last few hundred meters of riverfront, German commanders stopped watching their own flanks. That mistake proved fatal. On the 19th of November, the Red Army answered. Operation Uranus struck not the exhausted Germans inside the city, but the weakly held flanks north and south of it, defended largely by Romanian and Hungarian divisions with a fraction of Germany's firepower. Those flanks broke within 2 days. Soviet armor raced across the open steppe and met 4 days later at Kalek, sealing shut a pocket the Germans would call, with grim precision, the Kessel, the cauldron. Inside it, nearly the entire 6th Army plus elements of the 4th Panzer Army, close to 300,000 souls. Cut off from resupply, retreat, and rescue. In the coldest winter in decades, Paulus's own generals begged him to break out while the ring was still thin. Hitler forbade it outright. Hermann Göring, in a moment of vanity that would cost tens of thousands of lives, promised the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army entirely by air, 500 tons daily, the minimum needed just to survive. The actual average came to less than 100 tons, cut down by Soviet fighters, brutal weather, and airfields falling one by one. Inside the cauldron, horses were eaten first, then boot leather boiled into something resembling food, then nothing at all. Frostbite took fingers, then hands, then feet, faster than Soviet bullets did. Typhus and dysentery moved through the starving ranks like a second army nobody had accounted for. Men who had marched in under summer sun, certain of victory, now lay frozen in trenches, waiting for a relief force that reached within 30 miles of the pocket, before it too was thrown back. By January 1943, the myth of German invincibility that had carried this army from the Channel to the gates of Moscow lay as dead as the men freezing in Stalingrad's cellars. Here is where Paulus's story turns from tragedy into something Germany has never fully known how to discuss. On the 30th of January, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, the highest field command in the German army. It looked on paper like an honor. It was closer to an instruction. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Hitler was not congratulating Paulus. He was handing him a title, and with it an unspoken expectation that a marshal facing certain defeat would take his own life or die fighting. Rather than surrender and hand the enemy a symbol of total German collapse, Paulus did not comply. On the 31st of January, barely a day after receiving his baton, he surrendered himself and the remnants of his command to Soviet forces from the basement of a bombed department store in the city he had failed to take. He did not raise a pistol to his own temple. He walked into the snow and gave himself up to the men who had spent 5 months killing his soldiers. By every unwritten rule of the army he had served his whole life, it was an act of disobedience greater than any tactical decision of the entire campaign. Hitler, hearing the news, reportedly raged that a bullet would have written Paulus's name into legend, while surrender wrote it into shame. 91,000 German soldiers followed their marshal into Soviet captivity that week, starving, frostbitten. Many barely able to walk. What happened to those 91,000 rarely makes the documentaries, built around tank movements and heroic last stands. Marched east through the same frozen steppe that had already killed so many of them. They died by the thousand from exposure, disease, and neglect in transit camps never built to hold so many broken bodies. Only a small fraction, close to 6,000, survived years of captivity to see Germany again. Some not until 1955, a decade after the war ended. Paulus lived. He testified against former colleagues at Nuremberg and settled in communist East Germany, which used him as a propaganda symbol, even as former comrades in the West branded him a traitor for surviving. He died in 1957, neither forgiven nor fully condemned by either Germany that claimed him. remembered less for who he was than for the one order he finally refused to follow. Here's the question worth sitting with tonight. For 5 months, Friedrich Paulus followed every order given to him, and 300,000 men paid for that obedience with their lives, their limbs, their sanity. Then, on the one occasion history remembers him for, he disobeyed, and it may have been the only decision in the whole battle that saved anyone at all. Was Paulus a coward for choosing to live when his Führer expected him to die? Or was he the only man in that frozen cauldron who understood that obedience itself had become the real enemy? Tell me in the comments what you would have done in that basement, with a pistol in one hand and 91,000 lives in the other.